Okay. Professor Randy LaPolla is a senior associate of the Center for Liberal Arts and Social Sciences at Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. He was a professor in the Center for Language Sciences, Institute for Advanced Studies in Humanities and Social Sciences, Beijing Normal University, Zhuhai Campus, China. And he was also professor of linguistics at Nanyang Technological University, Singapore, and chair professor of linguistics at La Trobe University, Melbourne, Australia, and director of the Research Center of Linguistic Typology at La Trobe. Before moving to Australia, he worked at the Academia Sinica in Taiwan and City University of Hong Kong. He has a lot of honors and titles, including the title of Chong Gong Scholar, selected by the Ministry of Education of the PRC, and also Fellow of the Australian Academy for the Humanities and President of the Australian Linguistic Society, and also honorary member of the Philippine Linguistic Society, and a lifetime member of the Singapore Association for Appliable Linguistics. Professor LaPolla's research started with a focus on the history and typology of Sino-Tibetan and Austronesian languages, but expanded to issues related to the nature of communicative behavior and then to human behavior generally, and the cognition which motivates it, and to finding functional explanations for the patterns found in human behavior. I first met Professor LaPolla back in 2013 at the International Systemic Functional Congress held by Sun Yat-sen University in Guangzhou. And Professor LaPolla was invited by the organizers, and particularly by Professor Michael Halliday. Professor Michael Halliday asked Professor LaPolla to, well, stir things up a bit as someone from outside the SFL, but to me, Professor LaPolla is very much someone from inside the SFL. He's very familiar with SFL theory and practice. Actually, he's very familiar with many of the world's linguistic schools and thoughts. So Professor LaPolla is in a very nice position to make this comparison and see what the strong points are of the systemic functional linguistics. So today, Professor LaPolla is going to give a talk on SFL as a very modern and widely applicable integrated approach to language and communication. Okay, now Professor LaPolla, please.
Thank you very much, Wang Lao Shi. That's very kind of you. Okay, today I'm going to be talking, as we said, about comparing, to some extent, comparing different aspects of linguistics and theories and things. But mainly, I just want to talk about how systemic functional linguistics is, although it's been around for a long time, it's actually a very modern approach, and I'll explain that in a minute. And it's also widely applicable, and that's why I like the title of this Martin Center for Appliable Linguistics. It's sad, though, that we have to put that in there because for such a long time, so much of linguistics has not been applicable to anything. And so we have to somehow, also there was this whole thing that applied linguistics was somehow inferior to so-called theoretical linguistics, as if you can have a theory of anything without, as if you could study anything without creating a theory of it. So I, in some ways, I like this title. In some ways, it's just sad that we have to add something like that to say that this is actually a useful theory. So this talk is actually one I originally planned to present at a conference at the Martin Center last year this time, but could not due to health problems. And I'm very happy the organizers, Wang Lao Shi and others who were part of the conference have asked me to still give the talk, the same talk that I was going to give last year. And I really regretted not being able to give it last year. So they gave me this opportunity to meet everybody and talk about this. I'm going to respond to some of the issues that the organizers of that conference put up for possible discussion. But first, I would like to make some general comments about SFL and linguistics generally. The more I learn about language and linguistics, and this is an ongoing thing, not just now, but for so many years when I was teaching, especially when I was teaching Halliday in linguistics, I would read the intro to functional grammar page cover to cover every time I taught it. And so I have read that book at least 15 times, and each time I read it, as I'm flipping the pages, I'm thinking, oh my God, this is so deep. Oh my God, this is so great. Oh my God, there's so much in here. I always get something new out of reading it. So it's the newer volumes are kind of more like reference volumes, but I was at that time, this is many years ago, I was using the second edition, which doesn't have all the systemic stuff, but it was enough, as Professor Halliday explained in the preface, that it fit into one semester, and so that's why I was using it. And so the more I learn about language and linguistics, the more respect and admiration I have for Professor Halliday and the SFL community he built, because he was very happy when he would talk about how happy he was that people, his students, would run with the theory. He wasn't one of these other types. I've worked with other people in different theories who are very possessive of their theory. Chomsky is a prime example. He tried to destroy any students who tried to contribute to the theory without first getting his approval. Like, this is the whole generative semantics thing that happened in the early 70s, where he tried to destroy their careers just because they wanted to talk about meaning, and he didn't want to talk about meaning. So some people who create theories are very possessive of them, but Professor Halliday was not like that at all. He really appreciated that people would understand the theory and then run with it. In other words, apply it to many different things, to art. I remember him telling me how he liked how they applied it to the analysis of art and other things, because as I'll talk about in a minute, it's human behavior, and language is human behavior. And so the things that we understand about language and the cognition behind it also are applicable to other aspects of human behavior. And this is something that I think Professor Halliday understood. In the 1960s and 70s, Chomsky was almost 100% dominant in the US. It was really horrible at that time. But there were 3 scholars who did not jump on the bandwagon and even tried to refute some of Chomsky's non-empirical assumptions. He had a lot of these non-empirical assumptions, such as the poverty of the stimulus, and all languages look like English on a deeper level. And you can learn about all languages just by studying English. He's still saying crazy things. Like in 2012, he published an interview with a French philosopher where he said, scientists don't study data. So that they actually ignore typological information because they say it's not relevant to what they're doing. And so the 3 people were Dwight Bollinger at Stanford University, who kept pointing out problems with their methodology and also the general idea. And he was one of the earliest ones to talk about constructions. In his very early papers, he talked about that a lot of language is just memory, and we remember these chunks, what he called schemas, and then we use those. And that's pretty much what we talk about now in construction grammar. Michael Halliday, of course, was one of those. He was initially in the UK and then later in Australia. And he was a very polite and gentle person. So he wasn't not like Roy Harris. Roy Harris was very vehemently opposed to what I call Bloomfield's Chomsky structuralism. And so his work was mainly about criticizing that, and mainly in a relatively nasty way, whereas Michael Halliday was very polite and pointed out problems, but in a more polite way, but also at the same time showed how useful doing it differently can be. And that's why he was much more successful than Roy Harris, who kind of died in ignominy because people just didn't take him seriously. Especially the time he was writing was the height of Chomsky's popularity. In the 1980s, though, especially on the west coast of the US, it became clear, even to many of Chomsky's students, that his project had failed. And so they set out to create new theories in order to become the next Chomsky. So just Chomsky himself had kind of warped the field for people to think that there has to be one king one emperor or whatever, and then everybody else follows that. And so each one wanted to become the next Chomsky. They wanted to create the killer, just like everybody wants to make the killer app nowadays. In those days, you want to make the killer theory. The result, though, was a number of very similar, what we call unification-based approaches to language, because they were basically structuralist, not really very different from each other, but also not very different from Chomsky's work, where there was seen to be a separation between syntax and semantics and phonetics, and these were different, they call this a componential view, the different components. And the main mechanism of the theory was to find a way to unify the syntactic representation and the semantic representation. So they would have a very complex syntactic representation and a very complex semantic representation, and then you had to link them together in some way. So this is like lexical functional grammar, head-driven phrase structure grammar, role and reference grammar, and many, many others. And most of them are no longer relevant, like LFG is, I don't know, that I never hear about anymore. The problem is that if you never separate the syntactic representation and semantic representation, if you take a constructionist point of view, you don't separate them, so there's no need to unify them again. It's a very unnatural kind of thing, although this is something that goes back to, again, Chomsky, Bloomfield-Chomsky structuralism, because both Bloomfield and Chomsky argued that you could analyze structure without meaning. And that was something that it's now hard to imagine that, especially if you're an SFL person where everything is based on meaning. So Roman Jakobson wisely said, language without meaning is meaningless, and which it is. And so both attempts by Chomsky and Bloomfield failed in that regard. Except for role and reference grammar, all were based on English and assumed the English categories were universal. And a lot of people still believe some of this stuff. But Robert Van Valen and William Foley were at UC Berkeley at the time and also wanted to create a theory, but they did something different from the others. They asked a simple question: what if we didn't start with English and instead started with typologically very different languages, such as Tagalog, Lakota, and Barai, three completely different, structurally completely different languages in different parts of the world? How would that theory look? And what they came up with was this, what's now called role and reference grammar, the beginning of, it actually is one of the earliest attempts at a constructionist approach. And it's a more empirically approach because it doesn't assume, it was put together mainly about grammatical relations, and it didn't assume that all languages have grammatical relations, or that even within a single language, all constructions have grammatical relations or manifest grammatical relations or syntactic relations. So you have to look at each construction individually. And so this gave me, the reason why I got involved in role and reference grammar is because it gave me a way of understanding what was happening in Chinese, because I was learning all of these theories. I learned so many theories at that point. I was a grad student in the 1980s and learned so many theories. And role and reference grammar was the only one that gave me a chance to understand what was going on in Chinese, because that was my main goal, was to understand how is Chinese so different from English and yet it can still communicate? I mean, first of all, even just thinking that would put me in opposition to many people who argue that Chinese and English are the same. So like I had a colleague at City University who would end every one of his talks saying, see, Chinese is just like English. He was a formalist. And I would end every one of my talks say, see, Chinese is nothing like English. I still think Chinese is a very unique language and needs to be studied on its own terms. But the problem with role and reference grammar is because it was developed at that time when unification-based approaches were popular, the so-called linking algorithm in that program became overly important. And so it's still stuck in the unification-based approach period, even though they've tried to make it more pragmatic. That's so Van Valen calls it structural functionalism, because he's he's got basic structuralism, but then he added information structure based on Knud Lambrecht's work. And so he thinks it's functional. We're now fully into the era of constructionist and cognitive uses-based approaches, but Professor Halliday was way ahead of the curve in this, using an integrated approach. What I mean by integrated approach here is not doing like what I talked about earlier as the structuralist componential approach, where you can just look at syntax by itself, or you can look at semantics by itself, or you can look at phonology by itself, that these things are all part of a single communicative act. And it is an act because this is behavior, and you cannot, even modern constructionist approaches usually ignore the phonology, but as Professor Halliday and Bill Graves talked about in their book, Bill Graves, amazing guy, he actually was arguing that words without phonology are dead words. They don't really have any meaning because a lot of the meaning comes from the phonology. So you need especially the intonation and whatever. So they published a book about this. And this is what I mean by integrated. You have to, if you look at the silver text at the end of the intro book, you can see how all of the different analyses are put together, that they really need to be looked at together. So it's an integrated approach, which is something that Roy Harris was also arguing for, an integrated approach where you look at the entire speech act and the what's going on within the context of situation and the context of culture. So this is another important aspect of so-called integration, is that it's taking into account the much broader context, not just the linguistic context, but the context of situation, which is not the physical situation as Professor Halliday understands it, but it's the kind of the immediate context of what's going on in the conversation. What I talk about in a different way is the context of interpretation. You create a context of interpretation. And then you have the context of culture, which is kind of where a lot of your basic, or you might call a basic paradigm of how you understand things in the world. And how that's very important to being able to communicate with other people who have a similar paradigm for understanding the world. Professor Halliday's approach was different in being paradigmatic. There's a different use of the word paradigm. When I said paradigm just now, I mean a kind of a scientific framework. What it's not doesn't have to be scientific, it's just our frameworks for understanding things. So our religion, our culture, all of these things are a kind of framework that helps us to understand among ourselves. But Halliday's approach was paradigmatic in another sense, that it wasn't a chain theory like most of the syntax theories were, but also it was not also, it had that, of course, but the paradigmatic means it was a system of choices. And this is a really nice aspect of the theory, and it leads to some of the usefulness of the theory, because you can actually, based on the choices that the writer or speaker make in producing a text, you can judge the text. You can say, okay, in this particular point, I'll come back to this again later, but this particular point, he chose this structure rather than another structure to express a certain meaning. So these are different possibilities that could appear in that same thing. That's why it's called paradigmatic. And so he then could say, all right, this was a good choice, this was a bad choice. So say, for example, I once heard Professor Halliday give a talk at City University where he compared the last two paragraphs of Darwin's Origin of Species with a translation of the same book, the same two paragraphs. And Darwin was an amazingly good writer. And the last two paragraphs are so beautifully done. I really recommend anybody who likes SFL should read these last two paragraphs, because the flow of the text, the thematic progression is so beautiful. And the coolest thing is the last word of the whole book. The book is about evolution, and the last book of the last sentence of the book ends with how these things are evolved. And evolved is the last word, which is really cool. But in the Chinese, he showed how in the Chinese the translator did not pay attention at all to the thematic progression, and it doesn't have at all the same power or beauty that the original had. And so here you can use this for evaluating your writing. And I've done this in my own writing, where I've gone through several versions of something I'm writing and playing with the thematic progression and seeing which is most effective. And so we can improve our writing with this theory. This is something that no other theory does, giving you the ability to judge and make and actually improve your writing. So it's paradigmatic and showing the different argument structures. So what's interesting also is his approach was construction based in the sense of showing how the different argument structures, what I mean by argument structures is the sets of arguments. You know, when he introduces the different processes, what he's really talking about is the argument structures, and the argument structures determine the process, because it's not a matter of the verb, it's the process. Because the same verb, you know, like say feel, if you use it in I feel sick today, I feel he's an idiot, I just felt the table with my hand, those are the same verb, but used with different argument structures. And so the meaning that we understand from it is quite different. So it isn't a matter of the verb, and that's why he doesn't really talk about the meaning of verbs. What he talks about is processes and how the different processes go along with different argument structures. But also how it's used in the overall construction and the meaning of the overall construction. This is one of the key tenets of construction approaches. His view is different also for being about meaning. Unlike Bloomfield-Chomsky structuralism, as I mentioned, they tried even to not talk about meaning at all. Professor Halliday's view is based on how language is a systemic resource for meaning and the choices involved in that. So this is where the paradigmatic view comes in. There are choices for expressing a particular meaning. So it's like a paradigm. So language, so there are also some of these tenets that you find in Hallidayan linguistics or actually go back to his teacher Firth in the London School. So things like language as a part of the social process, and so context plays a crucial role. Meaning is function within context. So this is something that we have had to rediscover outside of SFL, that meaning doesn't exist anywhere outside our heads, that we create a particular meaning for something within a particular context in, you know, usually directed to a certain person. So you put together all of this, what I was talking about, this context of interpretation, and then you create it's called abductive inference. You abductively infer what the speaker's intention is in saying or doing the communicative act, because communicative act doesn't have to be language. Languaging, which we now use as a verb, languaging is just one type of communicative behavior. There's many other types. You know, you can raise an eyebrow, you can smile, you can wave your hand, you can do all kinds of things. You can even moving your body. In some operating theaters, doctors will move their body in a certain way to notify the nurse to hand him or her particular tools. So you can use anything to communicate, and even things that are not part of your body you can use to communicate. And I use a lot of examples of this in a course I teach about this. So there are also different levels of contextualization. So you need to analyze these things in a particular way. Like for first, there were systems of systems. It wasn't just one system like in the structuralist, the normal structuralist view. There were systems of systems. So this is the key thing here, language as meaningful behavior. So language doesn't exist anywhere. This is something that really took linguistics down the wrong path because of this written bias, because linguistics came from two sources. One was philology, which had a very strong written bias, and then you had Boas and Sapir working on American Indian languages and developing anthropological linguistics, and that became another whole aspect of linguistics. But they were more, they didn't have written languages in most cases, so they were more into understanding the behavior of the speakers, and particularly what they call the psychology of the speakers, their worldview as manifested in the language. And they assume that all kinds of behavior are meaningful, and that's why Lévi-Strauss even took some aspects of this to look at other, anthropological, other aspects of anthropology, as all types of now human behavior could be seen as meaningful. Language is just one type of meaningful behavior. So, because all meaning is created in your mind, and so this is kind of a general principle of our cognition, that our cognition, as Grice argued, it's a kind of causal theory of cognition, that our main thing for creating, and also Peirce, the philosopher, Charles Sanders Peirce, argued that the abductive inference, the kind of inference we use in communication, is the only way that we really create new meaning, that induction and deduction don't create new meaning. So, and then you have linguistics as the study of meaningful human behavior in society. So this is what I've been arguing, that linguistics organizations like the US Linguistics Society, that they really shot themselves in the foot by saying linguistics is the scientific study of language, when there's so much more to communicative human behavior. But they restrict themselves only to this because of this written bias and because of just somehow thinking that language is somehow special, when actually the language is not that special. Linguistic knowledge is just knowledge. It's not something special, sorry, to those who think it's different. So Professor Halliday was also the first to have a systemic view of information structure. He was very much influenced by the Prague School, but went in a different direction somewhat from the Prague School. And he understood how important information structure is to understanding language structure. I mean, he took theme riem from the Prague School, but his typology of focus structures, you have the broad focus and the narrow focus. This was not part of Prague School teaching. And so this is something he developed. And then the information structure, this type of information structure, is also a constructionist view, as each different configuration for information structure purposes is also a construction. What Lambrecht, who built on Professor Halliday's work, he basically just added one other category to Professor Halliday's work, what he called sentence focus, on information structure. And he called these different ways of expressing the so-called same meaning as allo-sentences, just like allophone or allomorph, very much akin to the paradigmatic system choices in SFL. So I'll give you some quick thing. Sorry, I didn't give glosses here because it wouldn't fit on one slide. But this is a famous passage from Rudin Weiss, the scholars, a book from the late Qing dynasty, and the first page even. And so, but what it says is, I've written this A, B, C. These are sections of this short text where B is one topic chain, C is a different topic chain. A actually starts the topic chain for B, but it's not a topic comment structure. It's a presentative structure. So the first sentence, A, introduces this person, the guy named Wang Mian, but they don't say his name is Wang Mian yet. They just say there was a person who was a very upright person. I'll just translate it roughly. And this person in B1, it says this person was surnamed Wang. And in B2, his given name was Mian. And in B3, he lived in Zhuji Xian, in a county of Zhuji, in the what do you call it, Nongcun? In a village in this Zhuji Xian. And then the key thing I want to mention here is this B4, where it says when he was 7, died his father. Now, the reason why I say died his father is that's exactly how it's presented in Chinese. It's not the usual way to say, if you want to say his father died, you would say his father died. You would say 他的父亲死了. So you would have 父亲 as the topic, the father as the topic, and died as the comment on that. But in this one, it's reversed. And the reason why it's reversed is because it's being presented as an event. So 死了父亲 is a kind of event, died a father, or died his father. And this happened when he was 7, and this is all made relevant to the topic Wang Mian, this person that they're talking about in this topic chain. Now, the reason why I'm mentioning this is because this has somehow confused a lot of linguists along the way, where they try to force this into an English style construction and make it into a transitive clause or something like that. And formalists will make all kinds of covert this and covert that, and it doesn't make any sense. It's actually a very simple thing that you have a very common construction in Chinese, which is a presentative construction like 死了父亲 or 下雨了, when the rain falls, falls the rain, we say falls the rain, or 出祸了, happened a catastrophe. These kind of things are really very common in Chinese, and they've often been called 倒装句, kind of turned around sentences, but they're not. They're just a kind of presentative clause, just like in English when we have something like there was an old woman who lived in a shoe. Instead of saying an old woman who lived in a shoe lived in this place or something like that. So it's just presenting an event in this case rather than a person, but it's and it happened when he was 7. Now the thing is, this is what I mean by this paradigmatic choice, that he could have used his father died, the normal topic comment structure, but that would have messed up the topic chain. So he wanted to keep the topic consistent. You know, this Wang Mian, this guy Wang Mian, he wanted to keep that topic consistent. So he used this eventive thing and then made that the comment about Wang Mian. So you can use these events as comments in a topic comment structure. And I'll give you 2 other examples in a minute too, or 1 other example. And then the C is just then switches topics to his mother, that she did some sewing to allow him to go to school. So this is what I'm talking about here with this. It's both a choice thing and also the choice between different structures. Now, why does Chinese have this structure? Why didn't they just use a passive like we would in English? In English, if you say, you know, John got up in the morning and he ate breakfast and got dressed and then walked out the door and was hit by a car. So if you want to maintain this topic continuity in English, you use a passive. Now, Chinese doesn't have a typologically real passive. They have ways of fronting certain arguments, or not really fronting, I don't like the word fronting. They have alternative structures where different arguments can appear at the beginning of the clause as a topic. I don't like using these Chomskyan terms like topicalization or whateverization, because there's no deep structure and surface structure. It's just different alternative allo-sentences, as Knud called them. So in this case, the passive wasn't really an option, but Chinese has another method, which is using this event type structure. as the comment in a topic comment structure. So you maintain the topic, but instead of setting up a new topic, you present something that happened to that referent as an event. And so this is a very interesting aspect of Chinese that people kind of overlook. You have to look at why would they have this system? Because they don't have grammatical relations or syntactic relations. And so they don't really need a passive, because a passive is something that feeds into syntactic kind of restricted neutralizations in syntactic structures that we call syntactic relations. Chinese doesn't have those. They haven't grammaticalized that. So, in other words, there's no subject or object, things like that. And so they use this thing to maintain topic continuity. Now, well, this is what I just said. So now let's look at another example of the contrast. So these are two different passages from online. And so in the first one, it's the girl, you've raised the question, it's very serious, but now I am hungry, or my belly is hungry. And so I want to eat something first. And the way he says this is 我肚子饿. Now, the structure of 我肚子饿, the bold part, is my belly hungry, literally. So it's a double topic construction. You have 肚子饿 as a topic comment construction, and then you also have 我 as a topic, a kind of higher level topic, and then 肚子饿 as the comment to that topic. So you have complex information structures, what we call focus structures. And so in this case, the stomach, the 肚子, is serving as a secondary topic. Now, that contrasts with this topic plus event construction that I was just talking about, which again is very common in Chinese, although they somehow made a big deal out of this one at Wangmian. It's actually very easy to explain. In fact, all the Chinese word order structures are easy to explain with information structure. So in this case, I complained that his movements were too slow and caused me to get hungry. So here the get hungry is 我饿了肚子, where the 饿了肚子, the stomach doesn't occur as a secondary topic. It occurs within the focus because the 饿了肚子 is presented as an event, even though it's the stomach that's getting hungry. And then this event is predicated on me, I, 我. And so these are choices that the writer or speaker makes in presenting this information about being hungry. And so each language will have different possibilities for these. And this is this whole paradigmatic idea that you can make choices, and then we can also evaluate when they make a certain choice, is it a good thing to do? So in this case, the focus is not so much on the belly being hungry, but on what happened to me, that I got hungry. So then they use this 我饿了肚子 instead of 我肚子饿了. Like Professor Halliday, I mentioned Roy Harris was way ahead of his time, but unlike Professor Halliday, he mostly criticized Bloomfield-Chomsky's structuralism and didn't show how useful an integrationist approach could be. In Professor Halliday's case, a large number of people saw how useful his approach is, and so applied it to education, translation, and other things. But that actually, in the weird sociological aspects of linguistics, ended up being a sort of bad thing, because people were so used to thinking of linguistic theories as useless, and if it's useful, then it must be applied linguistics, and if it's applied linguistics, then it's not theoretical linguistics. And so, for example, when I was teaching a course on Halliday linguistics in Australia, I had a graduate student as a teaching assistant. She was from Melbourne University, and I assume had only studied formal linguistics, because she just really did not want to learn SFL. She was not open to it at all. And she just thought, this is applied linguistics. I don't do applied linguistics. I don't want to learn applied linguistics. she just was shut off to it. It really bothered me. Because for me, if you're doing linguistics and it's not applicable to anything, why the hell are you doing it? But I guess for some people, it's just a matter of showing how smart you can be by playing with these logical games. In fact, one formalist I knew in Taiwan actually said that to me. She said, sometimes I think what we're doing is just a logic game. And I said, bingo, that's what you're doing. You're not really looking at language. You're just creating these models that you like to play with. For me, the question is not whether a theory is right or wrong, as all valid theories are subjective interpretations of a set of data, but how useful the analysis is for the purpose one has. And the theory may differ with different purposes, as Y.R. Zhao pointed out in 1934, a famous article called The Non-Uniqueness of Phonemic Solutions. And Halliday's teacher, J.R. Firth, and Professor Halliday himself also each discussed some years later the same concept. And it seems like, common sense. So just to give you examples of how I applied this kind of way of thinking is when I was at City University in Hong Kong, I taught Professor Halliday's Introduction to Functional Grammar in several courses with different names at both the UG and PG level in the linguistics section of our department and in the translation section of the department. To anyone I thought needed to get more meaning out of text and be able to create more easily understandable text. At City U, I never taught the Roland Reference Grammar syntax book that I wrote with Van Balen in 1997 because I thought that was not useful for the purposes just mentioned. It is mainly for people who want to become linguistics professors. And at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore, I taught a course called Theories of Grammar, where I taught a sort of meta-theoretical view, just so that students would have a wide understanding of different ways of looking at language, going through the history of linguistics of the last 200 or so years and introducing 8 or 9 theories that I thought can be useful given certain conditions. So the students could apply whichever theory worked better for a particular purpose. Because all theories are just, as Firth talked about, they're just something you create. They used to deride Firth's view by calling it hocus pocus linguistics, because he said you create your categories as a way of making sense of the data, but you can change that anytime you want. These are not from the language, they are from the linguist. He creates those categories as a way of trying to make sense of it, just like we create categories in the world, trying to make sense of the world. Is of course included, my course, of course, included SFL. I originally thought this would be a killer of a course and not attract students, go through 8 theories. Normally even 1 theory, they freak out. But it was always full, and students even said it was fun, which surprised the hell out of me. Okay, now I want to turn to the questions. It's already been a while. I want to turn to the questions that were brought up in the conference. So how language description feeds back into a theory. So this is something that I talked about a little bit earlier when I mentioned Roland. The reason I mentioned Roland Reference Grammar is because they used language description, different language description, not just English, but other language descriptions to inform their theory. And so their theory is better than a lot of the other theories because it is typologically informed. And it is a multilingual theory, not just the theory of English. So the question that was asked is, are they right that SFL has no general universal principles which were not derived from the description of English? Now, this is a very leading question, but it's also a misunderstanding of what Professor Halliday was doing with his description of English in his intro books and elsewhere. He did not base SFL on English. In fact, he started developing the theory as a way of understanding a Chinese text, The Secret History of the Mongols. He was studying for his MA degree when he was studying in China in the late 1940s. He later applied the principles of SFL in describing English as an example of what could be done with the theory. Many of his students misunderstood this and assumed that all languages had to be analyzed in the same way as he analyzed English. He was very unhappy with that. When we were at the SFL Congress in 2013, we sat together during a presentation and talked about this. as he was disappointed the scholar presenting was doing just that, simply trying to force the analysis of English onto Chinese. There are general principles already, such as the metafunctions, which are types of meaning. And that is all you need to start an analysis, looking inductively, initially inductively, because that's how you do, you look at your data inductively. You don't bring anything to the data. There's no preconceived categories. You look inductively at how the speakers achieve the goals of the metafunctions. The details of the analysis will depend on the language and the particular goals involved. If you look at Professor Halliday's work on Chinese, where SFL started, it's not the same as his analysis of English, particularly the phonology, which is quite Firthian, but other aspects as well. I personally never started out with the idea of building a theory. I just want to understand how the languages I'm interested in work and how communication can work even though languages are so radically different. The theory emerges out of doing an inductive analysis of natural data. I tell my students, the language is your best teacher and trust the language. Don't let theory become a blinker, you know, like this, what the horses wear, you know, these things called blinkers or blinders, to prevent them from looking left and right. Don't let the theory become like that, a hindrance to seeing what is going on in the language because your theory says it should be a certain way. I'm aware of one really extreme example of this at Chinese University of Hong Kong, where a group of formalists was working with a friend of mine who was an E speaker, you know, the Yi Zhu. And they just do elicitation in the sense of translating sentences from Mandarin or English, which is not a good way to do fieldwork. You don't get really to the language. But anyway, what they were doing is having him translate these sentences, and he did it. He was a linguist himself, you know, not a kid or anything. He's been in the field for a long time and knows E very well. He is an E himself and grew up speaking the language. But they somehow the data that he gave them didn't fit their theory. So rather than challenge their theory, they said that he didn't know how to speak his language. And this, of course, really annoyed him. But it just shows the kind of attitude they have, that the theory is the primary thing and languages. Actually, Robin Lakoff, before she changed from being a Chomskyan acolyte to being one of the founders of pragmatics, said that data is cheap, theory is important. But I think later on, she probably changed her mind once Chomsky threw her out of the inner fold of Chomskyan linguistics. Some linguists think the job of a linguist is to apply labels from some universal list of categories in describing a new language. That way never leads to insights and overlooks the diversity of linguistic structures. There are no universal categories, so applying names as if there are is again forcing the analysis of one language on another, and that's not going to teach you anything. Okay, use of machine computational automation for data. It's very popular now to use databases to try to write papers, but the problem with most of the databases is that you can search, but many corpora only include a written form. There's no phonology, there's no, any workup really. And some are limited to searches which do not show the entire context, and you're limited to say 50 characters or whatever of the strings produced from the search. But sometimes useful work can be done with this sort of corpus, as with one of my students at NTU who used the Mandarin Chinese database, the Beijing database, which has limitations. You don't get the full context. But she was able to discover 3 types of 3-participant event pattern in the data that no one had talked about before. So there's a big literature on these constructions that have 3 participants, 3 different roles within the same clause. And this is the way people are used to doing the research, is they look at these particular sentence types. But what she did was innovative, is that not to start with the constructions, but to start with the sense of 3-participant event. So looking for any way that 3-participant event was manifested in the data. And she found 3 different ways that this happens that no one else had ever talked about, because in Chinese, there's sometimes these 3-participant events are stretched over 2 or more clauses. So that was a very interesting finding. And she also talked about how the information structure affects how it is manifested. How do you negotiate putting forward an SFL description of your language compared to descriptions from other theories? As I mentioned a little earlier, although I co-wrote a textbook of Roland reference grammar with Robert Van Valen in '97, I only taught a course on RG once to a class of PhD students at Tsinghua University in Taiwan who were going on to become professional linguists. When I moved to Hong Kong, I realized the students were not going to go on to be PhDs in linguistics, but would take up jobs as government language officers, editors, and other language workers who did not need to know a lot of theories, but needed to be able to get more meaning out of texts and how to write better by knowing how to evaluate text. And also, and so I started teaching Professor Halliday's SFL in several different courses where it seemed appropriate. My postgraduate students mainly write grammars of undocumented languages for their PhD theses. Whatever framework they choose, I always bring Professor Halliday's insights to their attention and would love it if one of them used SFL entirely to document a language. But on the one hand, there isn't a long tradition of that, although Professor Martin has tried to change that for many years now. And on the other hand, it is more difficult to do an integrated and comprehensive analysis of a language rather than simply talk about syntactic structure and a bit of phonology, which is what most grammars are. And students in the old British colonies in particular in China usually only get 3 or 4 years to complete a PhD. So there really isn't enough time to do justice to a full integrated analysis. So description and teaching, do you use description as a resource for teaching SFL or linguistics or languages? And yes, at NTU, I used Professor Halliday's Introduction to Functional Grammar in a first semester course. In other words, these were freshmen who just got to college, got to the university, Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. So they had just got in there and I hit them with there's a class called the Structure of English, which used to be taught by other people as just a very boring, well, from my point of view, boring structuralist approach where just talking about very simple structures in English. My colleagues thought first-year students couldn't handle this Hallidayan approach, but it actually went very well, partly because Professor Halliday's analysis of English is so interesting because it doesn't just tell you what the patterns are, but from a meaning communication point of view, it tells you why they are the way they are, something structuralism overlooks entirely. And if anybody interested, there are video recordings of the lectures online, both on YouTube and Bilibili. I've argued with Martin Hasselmath and Matthew Dreyer, two structuralist typologists, about this, as they feel they should just look at form and not talk about why the forms are the way they are. So that when you say, okay, why are those forms like that? He said, oh, that's the grammar. So it's like, yeah, but why is the grammar that way? You know, and they don't want to talk about that. Dreyer even has an article in 2006 arguing against explanation in language documentation. I have, on the flip side, argued we need to go back to a more Humboldtian romanticist meaning-based approach in typology. Translation between descriptions. Other than lists of translated terms, how much of a description can be translated into other descriptions? How can this be implemented? If done inductively, each description should be unique to the extent that the language and culture it represents is unique. A good example is Matisov's Grammar of Lahu, published in 1973, for which he created his own system of categories that he felt reflected the language. You could only translate this into another type of description by doing damage to the theory of the language he had created. Again, every theory is subjectively created by the person doing the analysis. As Knud, 1970, argued, different paradigms, which are frameworks of science, are incommensurable. You cannot talk to each other. There is no easy way to translate between paradigms. In a paper published not long ago in China called 非结果主义语言学, non-structuralist linguistics, I compared the axioms of the Bloomfield-Chomsky structuralist with those of some of the non-structuralist approaches, looking at basic assumptions such as the definition of language, what counts as data. If data is studied at all, Chomsky, as I mentioned, has argued scientists don't study data. And what we are doing within the paradigm to show how radically different they are to the extent that one cannot talk to the other without misunderstanding. Actually, one time Huang Zhengde, a famous formalist linguist, asked me to go to his school and give talks, and I just said we don't have a common language. Sorry, and I didn't go. Within structuralist typology, there is a useful distinction made between the actual grammatical categories of particular languages, which are unique to the individual languages. There is an assumption that there are no cross-linguistic categories in typology now. And for some linguists, no cross-construction categories. That is, there's no global categories in the language. Every category is defined by the construction, not by the language. And comparative concepts. So comparative concepts are defined functionally and are not grammatical categories, but can be used for comparative purposes. But this can only be done, it allows comparison, but it can only be done if you're working within reference to structuralist concepts. So what inspires descriptive work? The romanticist Humboldtian or Boasian, Sapirian, Worfian approach is about getting to the worldview of the speakers. That is my goal in studying languages. This is what makes recording endangered languages valuable, is because they each manifest a different worldview. And then comparing them to see the diversity of ways of understanding the world. This is something that linguistics has kind of ignored for a long time, the diversity of ways of understanding the world and the different ways of it's manifested in language. Just a quick note about the history of linguistics. The Grimm brothers began documenting German dialects, the ones who Grimm fairy tales, and also created the first neo-grammarian law. Documenting German dialects because they wanted to understand the core way of thinking of the German speakers. This led to them comparing the dialects and developing sound laws for the development of the varieties, hence the beginning of the neo-grammarian school. But it grew out of Herdean romanticism. And so actually, the Grimm brothers are often not considered neo-grammarians because they were really romanticists. And also they weren't part of the manifesto of a neo-grammarian school. Okay, that's just about 1 hour. Wow. I don't have anything of a conclusion, but I hope we can have some discussion about some of the matters I brought up. Thank you.